It's amazing to think that 2022 marks the 60th anniversary of the release of Dr. No in cinemas. To celebrate, all 25 films have been re-released in cinemas one a week for 25 weeks. And over the last few weeks and months, I've been fortunate enough to be able to catch a great many of these and see them on the big screen for the first time at last. And coincidentally, Big Chief Studios also released two more of their 1/6 scale James Bond figures. Despite going up for pre-order in 2019, Dr. No and James Bond were finally made available in 2022, and there couldn't be a more fitting time for this release. And having been swept up in the recent Bond mania, I decided to take the plunge and pick myself up the 1/6 scale Sean Connery James Bond from Dr. No. Now, I should start off by pointing out that those who were patient enough or eager enough to place their pre-order all the way back in 2019 would have had this extra incentive piece, which was the overcoat and the hat. Sadly, my version does not come with either of these. So let's start out by taking a look at the packaging, and I have to say I do really like this packaging. It is quite bland in terms of the colours that they've used. They've gone for that sort of midnight blue, and I'm guessing that's because that's the same colour as outfit, but it is very nicely presented. We see that sort of gun barrel shape with the image of the figure in various poses, which looks very nice, very presentable. We have the collector edition, the 007 logo at the top there, and of course we have the big Dr. No logo at the bottom of the packaging, and we even have some of the thematic dots that we see in the opening credits to that film, which is a nice touch. Now, pleasingly, the artwork does wrap around the box. I do really like this, so that on this side panel we have the profile picture of the figure there, and we have a little smaller image there, which I think is really nice, especially if you're planning to stack these up with others in the collection. It's very displayable, it looks very presentable, and I think this is a really nice touch. If we flip this packaging around though and look at the other side panel, we can see a much more streamlined version of this artwork, where we just have essentially the 007 logo, which looks really nice, and again we have those dots at the bottom. This is a nice alternative. It's a lot more streamlined, as I said, in terms of the artwork, and is still very classy and very presentable. The reverse of the packaging is actually quite interesting. It's broken down into thirds, and at the top we can see the gun barrel, that famous logo there. Of course we have the Dr. No titles, and we have a little bit of information about the film. Then we have the second panel, which is obviously showing us a photograph of the action figure and telling us a little bit about the character of James Bond. And it also takes time in the final third to show us the other figure that is available in this collection. That is, of course, Dr. No. I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with this approach, but what does surprise me is that this is all in black and white, and I'm not quite sure why they went for that, because this would have looked a lot more visually striking if they'd had a bit of colour here, I think. As it is, it feels a little bit muted and a little bit bland and a bit text heavy. Now, when we open the box up and we slide that front cover away, underneath we will see this inner cardboard tray. This is in colour, and this looks really great. I love the image and how they've staged this shot. It looks really, really fantastic. You can slide this out and you can see lots of different artwork, different photographs of the figure in various poses. All look pretty fantastic. But if we flip that around, we can see that this actually provides a nice backdrop for our figure, and it is, of course, the famous gun barrel from the opening titles, which is wonderful. Now, I've got to be honest with you, my first impression upon opening this figure out of the packaging was, wow. I absolutely love this figure. I've got to be honest, I actually think it's so impressive in terms of its visual. And let's start by talking about this head sculpt. I think this has to be the best ever head sculpt I've ever seen of Sean Connery. Now, there might be people out there who disagree with that, and that's absolutely fair enough, but I think this is pretty uncannily accurate for my eyes. I love this. I think this is a really fantastic likeness of Sean Connery from Dr. No. This is wonderful. Every nuance, every line, every detail seems to have been captured just spot on. And as a comparison, here he is standing next to the Sideshow profile, which I seem to remember thinking was pretty good at the time. Now having this in my collection, obviously it kind of obliterates that perception. It's like night and day. So let's move on to the tailoring. Now, on the surface, I have to say this looks absolutely gorgeous. I think they've done a fantastic job. The material they've used is a very, very thick cotton. It feels very stiff and luxurious, which is wonderful. It has lovely trims when it comes to that sort of satin, sort of felt trim there at the top. On the lapels, looks fantastic. And the colour is exquisite. It is that midnight blue. In certain lights, it can look black, but that's exactly as it should be. This looks fantastic. You'll notice in his top breast pocket there is a piece of paper there that can emulate that tissue paper, which looks fantastic again, just really very nicely done. The pockets are all working real pockets, very carefully sewn in. There's not a hint of any fraying at this point, and it all looks really good. So top marks for this. I think the overall presentation of this tuxedo is pitch perfect. Now it does open, there is a magnet holding the jacket together, so there's no untidy buttons or unclipping things like that. It just pulls apart beautifully and then pulls back together nice and sharply. The shirt underneath is very nicely done. I did notice with mine that it seems a little bit off center. It does take a little bit of adjusting, and it does feel a little bit sloppy around the collar at the top there. It doesn't look quite right. It's absolutely fine though when the jacket is closed, but open like this it does feel a little bit off ever so slightly, but I am nitpicking here. It is lovely to see that gun holster there. It is a nice leather material on the actual holster itself, and it fits very snugly to his arm and is completely undetectable when the jacket is closed. So this is, again, for me, pitch perfect. I think they've done an absolutely incredible job with this part. That being said, I do have a little bit of a nitpick. I did notice that a little bit of the material is fraying already. The couple of strands coming loose here, which is a little bit of concern. It does make me a little bit worried about how this is going to hold up over time. But that said, this is a very small, minor nitpick. You can see an awful lot of care and a lot of attention to detail has gone into this figure. We have the nice application of these very small buttons on his sleeve here. The way the cuffs are folded down as well is very nicely executed. I will look at all the extra bits and pieces a little bit later, but one of the things I wanted to highlight while it's on his wrist is his watch, of course. I think they've done a really nice job. It is one single piece. It is made of a plastic, and there seems to be a sort of almost a glassy finish to the actual watch itself, which is nice. It definitely feels like a different texture to the piece, which is lovely, but it looks absolutely fantastic. There's a lot of little details in here. You can see the individual hands and the different points on the clock, which looks very nice. So I think they've done an excellent job with this watch. And as you would hope and expect, they have included that piping down the side of the pants there of that slightly different material. This looks really elegant, and they've done a very good job of this. Now, this is my first Big Chief figure, so I was a little bit surprised when I was looking at the feet of this figure, particularly these shoes here. When I turned the leg up, I realised that these are actually plastic feet, which is absolutely fine in terms of the sheen and how they look, because it does look like it's that leather material's been nicely polished, which is great, but the laces are just moulded in and they're not even painted a different colour. Not that they necessarily had to be, but they don't really stand out, and I was expecting to have real laces on these shoes. I appreciate they would have had to been very fine material to really work, but nevertheless I was a little bit surprised by this. It seemed a little bit sloppy, or perhaps lazy is a more appropriate word. The other surprise for me was that there are no socks, and it kind of makes sense because of course these are a plastic piece and it's all to do with the articulation of the joint that they've got there, that ball joint that we'll look at a little bit later. But I was still surprised not to see some effort to try and create the illusion of socks or some material there coming out of the shoe in some way. This is something that Sideshow did many years ago. So I was a little bit surprised to kind of see a backward step here and not have that detail. Not that it's strictly needed in all truth, but it's kind of nice to have. Now, I did want to take a moment to look at the display stand. The stand itself is fairly nondescript. It's just silver, a round sort of shape, but it does have this wonderful option for the name tag to go in on this frosted glass, and I do think this looks really great, especially when we can turn lights on. That's right, there are a handful of LED lights in the base of the base, for lack of a better word, that when you put this glass in and you tap the base, it lights up, and it does a really nice job, and I think it looks really elegant and quite classy, and I really like this feature. In the base there is a space for 3 AAA batteries to power this, and I have to say it works really well. The one thing I did want to point out, at first I thought mine was a little bit dodgy and perhaps it wasn't working, because I would find it would go on and then off, and I had to playing around with it and tapping it quite a lot before I realised that there is indeed a mechanism in the base that if you touch the side or tap the side, it will turn the light on or off, which I think is a really cool touch. I do really like that. I just didn't pick up on it straight away. Overall, this is a very cool feature. My only nitpick is I kind of wish that the LED lights went around the actual base of where the figure is standing and sort of uplit him that way. I think that would have been fantastic, but as it is, I do think this glass and having the light around it looks gorgeous. So let's move on to articulation. Now I'm going to be a little bit more gentle because this is a high-end collectible and I don't want to damage it or loosen the joints too much, but bear with me. He does have a ball joint in the head and neck, which means he can spin his head all the way around if you want him to. He can move it from side to side, he can lean it from side to side, and as you can see, there is a really healthy range of motion in this neck piece, which is wonderful, so they get top marks for this. He's got ball joints in the shoulders, of course, so that means his arms can lift all the way up. The only restriction comes from the very tight, thick material of this tuxedo, so that's something you're going to have to persevere with and work with if you want to get him into some of those more interesting dynamic poses. But nevertheless, he can do pretty much everything you would want him to do. Obviously, he has double joints in his elbows, being able to get that arm pretty much all the way back to his head there, and there is of course a ball joint in the wrist as well, meaning he can rotate his wrist 360 degrees, but he can also hinge it forwards and backwards as well. Now he does have articulation in the ab area as well, so he can spin from side to side if you want him to, but he can also lean forwards and backwards, and I was actually surprised by how generous this joint is, and it looks really good, and it moves very easily. There's not much resistance here at all. Like I said, I want to be very careful and very gentle with mine, but you get the sense. Now he's also got ball joints in the hips, of course, meaning he can kick his legs out a pretty healthy distance, and he's even got upper thigh articulation as well as lower leg articulation to be able to move from side to side, kick those legs forwards a good distance, and kick them back as well. Now this is all supported by double jointed knees, meaning that he can kick his lower leg right the way back up to his back, essentially, which is great stuff. And then finally there is this ball joint in the ankle, which allows for a fantastic range of motion. It doesn't look great when it's separated from the cuff of the trouser though, that's the only thing to be aware of, but you can get a fantastic range of motion out of it. It can move from side to side, it can pivot from side to side, and of course it hinges forwards and backwards. And as you would hope, he also comes with a whole host of extra pieces as well, including an additional 8 hands, ranging from flat palms to fists to trigger fingers. There's also a card shoe, which is absolutely fantastic, and of course there are the obligatory playing cards as well, and you come with the whole host. I've just shown a brief smattering of the ones that are included, but there's actually a ton of these included, which is lovely. You can put them in the tree, of course, and you can slide them out if you want, which is great. He also has casino checks of various amounts, which is great, and these are lovely and colourful. And then he has individual stacks of cash as well, which is a really cool touch. He also has his cigarette lighter, and I think that's his money pouch, I can't quite recall. And then he has his Beretta, and of course his Walther PPK in its special case, which is fantastic. I really love this case. I love how it's been rendered. It has that sort of wood effect. It has a gloss finish, which is fantastic. Mine doesn't quite close all the way, but nevertheless it looks great. That individual clip there painted in, and of course the inside is magnificent. We see the Walther PPK, we have those individual bullets, and we even have that sort of certificate on the top there. The Walther itself is very nicely moulded. There's not an awful lot in the way of paint apps though, that's the only thing, and it is a very matte finish. But you can pull the chamber away, and you can see there's actually a bullet in the top of the chamber, which is lovely, and of course you can even remove the clip, and again we can see another bullet there. So lovely little details here, and overall this is a very nicely sculpted piece, and as we will see, fits perfectly into his grip. And I have to say, I'm immensely pleased with this figure, with the actual posability of it, making the most of that articulation. You're able to strike all those iconic Sean Connery poses, which is absolutely key. Of course you're going to want to recreate moments like this. Now, as you can see, he is able to get his finger onto the trigger here. Of the two, though, I have to say, I think the Beretta is better suited to his gripping hand, and the finger is much easier to get through onto that trigger. But with the Walther, it's a little bit more of a struggle, but it still looks fine. And speaking of the Beretta, again, very nicely moulded, very similar to the Walther in the sense that there isn't really much in the way of paint apps. It does have that removable clip with the bullet in, and of course, the bullet at the top of the chamber as well. Now I am pleased to report that he is able to hold his casino checks and his bundles of cash in his tighter grip hands. Now the grip of these hands, the finger grip, isn't quite strong enough to be able to hold an individual playing card, but it can if you persevere with a little bit of playing with gravity and put a bunch together. He can still hold them, and it looks pretty good when you do it like this. And as I mentioned before, you are able to put him in so many different dynamic poses, ones that we'd associate with this particular version of Bond, and I think it's pretty fantastic all in all. I think the visual of this figure is absolutely gorgeous. I think they've done a really tremendous job of the presentation of the figure, and as I said, that likeness is killer. The one thing I would point out to you though is that in terms of his balance standing freely, not so good. Those ankles have a tendency to be quite loose. They kind of want to fall forwards or backwards quite a lot, so you will need the stand to support him. But all in all, I have to say, for my first Big Chief Studios figure, I'm really impressed. I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job of this version of the character. It's now my favourite James Bond figure in my collection, but I think I might be picking up a few more in the years to come. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.